Welcome to a peaceful journey across the ancient Mediterranean. As you settle into comfort, allow your mind to drift with me across the gentle waters that have connected civilizations for thousands of years. Tonight, we'll explore the quiet harbors, meandering coastal routes, and patient rhythms of trade that once linked distant shores. There's no need to remember any details. Simply let the soft geography of these ancient pathways carry you toward restful sleep as we begin our unhurried exploration. The Mediterranean Sea rests in a geological cradle, embraced by three continents: Europe to the north, Asia to the east, and Africa to the south. This inland sea stretches approximately 2,500 miles from the Strait of Gibraltar in the west to the shores of the Levant in the east. Its average depth is around 1,500 meters, though in the deepest point, called the Calypso Deep in the Ionian Sea, it reaches 5,267 meters below the surface. These numbers need not be remembered. They simply form the gentle backdrop of our journey tonight. The earliest traders to traverse these waters were the Phoenicians, who gradually established a network of trading posts beginning around 1500 BCE. They sailed in vessels with rounded hulls and single square sails, moving at an average speed of about 5 knots when conditions were favorable. The Phoenicians would carefully time their journeys to coincide with the most predictable weather patterns, typically embarking on trading expeditions between late spring and early autumn when the waters were calmest. The Mediterranean's relatively narrow shape created a unique environment for early navigation. Unlike the vast oceans, the Mediterranean offered seafarers the comfort of relatively short distances between landfalls. This geographical characteristic meant that early sailors could practice what we now call coast-hugging navigation, keeping the shoreline visible whenever possible. The gentle headlands and coves that mark the Mediterranean coastline provided natural markers for these early navigators, each with its own distinctive silhouette when viewed from the water. The colors of the Mediterranean waters shift with depth and season in the most subtle of ways. Near the shores, particularly in summer months, the water often takes on a clear, turquoise quality, gradually deepening to cobalt blue in the central basins. This coloration is the result of the sea's relative salinity, which averages about 38 parts per thousand, slightly higher than the world's oceans due to the high rate of evaporation and limited freshwater input. These gentle facts about the water itself formed an important backdrop to the development of trade routes, as the sea's consistent properties allowed for predictable navigation for those who had learned its ways. Wind patterns across the Mediterranean follow seasonal rhythms that ancient traders came to understand through generations of observation. The prevailing summer winds blow predominantly from the north and northwest, while winter brings more variable conditions with occasional strong storms from the south. Between these seasonal patterns lie periods of relative calm, particularly during the transitional weeks of late spring and early autumn. The early maritime cultures developed detailed knowledge of these patterns, passing this understanding from one generation of seafarers to the next through oral traditions and early navigational texts. As we continue our peaceful journey, let us now trace some of the primary sea routes that connected the ancient Mediterranean world. These pathways across the water linked civilizations in patterns that would remain relatively consistent for centuries, following the natural geography of the basin and the prevailing wind patterns we have just explored. One of the most fundamental routes extended from the Phoenician homeland in what is today Lebanon, westward along the northern African coast. This route followed the shoreline at a distance of approximately 3 to 5 miles offshore, allowing vessels to maintain sight of land while avoiding coastal hazards. Ships would depart from Tyre or Sidon, making their way westward with stops at established trading posts spaced roughly 30 nautical miles apart. This distance represented a comfortable day's sailing in favorable conditions. Each of these stops offered shelter in natural harbors, many of which featured distinctive geographical markers such as headlands or mountain peaks visible from the sea. The journey from the Levanten coast to Egypt typically took between 5 and 7 days in favorable conditions. Ships would sail parallel to the coast of what is now Israel, then continue past the relatively featureless shoreline of the Sinai Peninsula before reaching the western edge of the Nile Delta. The approach to Egypt required particular care due to the shallow, shifting sandbanks that extended seaward from the Nile's mouth. Experienced pilots learned to identify subtle changes in water color that indicated these underwater hazards. Navigating through established channels marked by the lightest variations in the sea's surface appearance. From Egypt, the coastal route continued westward, following the North African shoreline past Cyrenaica, with its distinctive rounded headland jutting northward into the Mediterranean. The coastline here featured a series of gentle bays and promontories, each creating natural harbors that could shelter ships during unexpected weather changes. The journey from Alexandria to Carthage might take as long as 15 to 20 days, depending on winds and the number of stops made along the way. Ships typically anchored each night in one of the many small harbors that punctuated this coastline, resuming their journey with the morning light. The Carthage to Gibraltar route completed the southern Mediterranean pathway, traversing approximately 1,000 nautical miles along the North African coast. This segment passed the coastlines of modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco before reaching the narrow strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. Along this route, ships would navigate past a landscape that gradually transitioned from fertile coastal plains to more arid regions where mountains occasionally approached the shoreline. The average sailing distance covered in a day along this route was approximately 30 to 40 nautical miles, meaning the complete journey might require 25 to 30 days of sailing in favorable conditions. Crossing the Mediterranean from south to north presented different challenges and followed different patterns. The most common north-south routes connected Carthage to Sicily and the Italian peninsula, a distance of about 100 nautical miles at the narrowest point. This crossing typically required 1 to 2 days of open water sailing, navigating by the stars at night and the sun's position during daylight hours. The island of Sicily served as an important waypoint in these Mediterranean crossings. Its distinctive triangular shape, visible from considerable distances on clear days, providing a reassuring target for sailors making the crossing from North Africa. Eastern Mediterranean routes connected the Levanten coast with Cyprus, Rhodes, and the numerous islands of the Aegean Sea. These routes formed a complex network, with islands serving as stepping stones that allowed ships to make shorter open water crossings of typically no more than 30 to 50 nautical miles. The Aegean Sea, with its multitude of islands, permitted particularly cautious navigation, as sailors could often sight their next destination before losing view of their departure point. The typical merchantman of the Middle Mediterranean trading period had a length of approximately 15 to 25 meters and could carry around 70 to 150 tons of cargo. These vessels sat relatively low in the water, with a draft of about 2 meters when fully loaded. Their round-bottomed design prioritized cargo capacity over speed, meaning they typically maintained an average speed of 4 to 6 knots under favorable conditions. When winds were contrary, ships would seek harbor and wait, sometimes for days or even weeks, for conditions to improve. This unhurried approach to maritime trade established a gentle rhythm to commerce that followed natural patterns rather than rigid schedules. Harbor depths along these routes varied considerably, but generally ranged from 3 to 6 meters in the most frequently used anchorages. Ships would approach these harbors with particular care, often reducing sail and using oars for precise maneuvering in the final stages of their approach. Many harbors featured distinctive entrance markers, such as temples built on headlands or stone towers that could guide mariners to the safest approach channel. The entrance channels themselves were typically oriented to provide protection from the most common wind and wave patterns, creating pools of relatively calm water even during moderate weather events. As we continue our peaceful exploration of ancient Mediterranean trade routes, let us now consider the gentle patterns of commerce that flowed along these waterways, creating connections between distant geographical regions. The movement of goods across the Mediterranean followed patterns determined by regional resources, creating a network of interdependence that would last for centuries. Olive oil formed one of the most consistent trade goods throughout Mediterranean history. The annual production of olive oil in ancient times varied considerably based on weather conditions and the alternate bearing nature of olive trees. In good years, A region like Attica might produce approximately 30,000 amphorae of olive oil, with each amphora containing about 20 to 25 liters. These amphorae were typically made of fired clay, with walls approximately 2 centimeters thick, making them sufficiently durable for maritime transport while remaining relatively lightweight. The standardized shapes of these storage vessels allowed for efficient stacking in a ship's hold, with each vessel typically carrying between 100 and 400 amphorae, depending on its size. The olive-growing regions circled the Mediterranean in a discontinuous band, approximately 100 to 200 kilometers wide, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula through southern France, Italy, Greece, and parts of the Levant and North Africa. This distribution closely followed climate patterns, particularly the isotherm representing average winter temperatures above 4 degrees Celsius, below which olive trees cannot survive. The relationship between geography and olive cultivation created natural patterns of surplus and demand, with ships carrying oil from regions of abundance to those where olives could not be grown, or where local production was insufficient to meet demand. Grain represented another fundamental trade good, with wheat and barley flowing from fertile growing regions to population centers throughout the Mediterranean basin. The North African coast, particularly Egypt, and the regions surrounding Carthage, produced substantial grain surpluses. Annual wheat production in the Nile Valley during favorable years could reach approximately 400,000 tons, a significant portion of which was exported across the Mediterranean. Ships carrying grain typically displaced between 70 and 150 tons, meaning a single vessel might carry enough wheat to feed approximately 1,000 people for 1 month. The sailing time from the Egyptian delta to Rome, a common grain route during the later periods, averaged between 20 and 30 days, depending on winds and intermediate stops. This created a rhythmic pattern to grain shipments, with vessels departing Egyptian ports after the harvest in April and May, sailing northward with the prevailing summer winds. The total volume of this grain trade gradually increased over centuries, reaching approximately 200,000 tons annually during the height of the Roman period, requiring a fleet of perhaps 800 to 1,000 vessels making regular journeys. Metals moved along different geographical pathways, flowing from mining regions to manufacturing centers. Copper from Cyprus, the island whose name gave us the Latin word for this metal, traveled throughout the eastern Mediterranean in the form of ingots weighing approximately 30 kilograms each. A typical trading vessel might carry between 100 and 200 of these ingots, representing about 3 to 6 tons of copper. The sailing route from Cyprus to the manufacturing centers of the Aegean followed a gentle arc northward, with stops at Rhodes and various Aegean islands, covering a total distance of approximately 500 nautical miles. Tin, necessary for bronze production, traveled much greater distances, often originating in the distant northwestern regions of Europe. This metal would follow overland routes to Mediterranean ports before continuing by sea to bronze-working centers. The scarcity of tin deposits created one of the longest trade networks of the ancient world, spanning thousands of kilometers and connecting regions with vastly different geographical characteristics. The overland routes that connected to these maritime pathways followed natural corridors determined by topography. Mountain passes and river valleys created natural channels for the movement of goods, with elevation changes and water availability determining the pace and pattern of travel. The route connecting the Aegean coast to the interior of Anatolia, for instance, followed river valleys that created natural passages through the Taurus Mountains, with elevation gradually increasing from sea level to passes at approximately 1,000 to 1,500 meters above sea level. Caravans would typically cover between 15 and 25 kilometers per day on these inland routes, establishing a slow rhythm of commerce that contrasted with the somewhat faster pace of maritime trade. Seasonal variations in trade activities followed the natural patterns of agriculture and weather. The most active trading period extended from late April through October, when winds were most predictable and storms least common. This period also coincided with the Mediterranean harvest cycle, with agricultural products becoming available for transport during these months. The winter period from November through March saw dramatically reduced maritime activity, with ships typically remaining in harbor during these months of unpredictable weather. This seasonal rhythm created natural cycles of activity and rest throughout the Mediterranean basin, with populations in port cities expanding and contracting in response to these patterns. The relationship between production regions and consumption markets created stable, predictable trade routes that would endure for centuries, with only minor variations. Wine from regions with suitable growing conditions would travel to areas where viticulture was impractical. Pottery from centers with appropriate clay deposits and manufacturing traditions would distribute their products throughout the Mediterranean. Luxury goods like perfumes, dyes, and jewelry would follow similar pathways, but in smaller quantities and higher values, often traveling aboard the same vessels carrying bulk commodities. These patterns of exchange linked distant geographical regions into a single, interconnected economic space, despite the considerable distances and natural barriers that separated them. The mountains, deserts, and seas that might otherwise have isolated these populations instead became corridors of connection, with human ingenuity adapting to and utilizing natural geographical features to facilitate rather than prevent interaction. As we deepen our restful journey through the ancient Mediterranean trading world, let us now consider the gentle rhythms of climate and season that shaped the patterns of maritime commerce. The Mediterranean climate follows predictable annual cycles that have remained relatively consistent for thousands of years, creating the environmental context within which ancient trade routes developed and operated. The Mediterranean climate zone is characterized by hot, dry summers and mild, wetter winters. This pattern extends around the Mediterranean basin in a band typically reaching 200 to 400 kilometers inland from the coast, gradually transitioning to continental climate patterns as distance from the moderating influence of the sea increases. Average summer temperatures in coastal regions typically range between 23 and 27 degrees Celsius, while winter temperatures along the northern shores average between 8 and 14 degrees Celsius, and slightly warmer along the southern and eastern coasts. These temperature patterns created natural sailing seasons that determined the rhythm of Mediterranean trade. The primary sailing season, known to later Romans as Mare Aperdum open sea, extended from late March or early April through October. During these months, storms were less frequent and winds more predictable, allowing for safer and more efficient maritime travel. The winter period, called Mare Clausum closed sea, saw dramatically reduced sailing activity due to frequent storms, reduced visibility, and less predictable winds. Wind patterns across the Mediterranean basin follow seasonal patterns that ancient mariners came to understand through generations of observation and experience. During the summer months, the prevailing winds in the eastern Mediterranean blow from the northwest, the result of a persistent high-pressure system that develops over the eastern North Atlantic and extends into the western Mediterranean. These winds, called the Etesian winds by the ancient Greeks, typically begin in mid-May and continue through September, blowing with the greatest consistency in July and August. The typical pattern of these summer winds begins with gentle morning breezes of approximately 5 to 10 knots, gradually strengthening to 15 to 20 knots by mid-afternoon, before diminishing again in the evening. This diurnal pattern created a natural rhythm to daily sailing activities, with ships often departing harbors in the early morning hours to take advantage of the developing favorable winds. The consistent northerly component of these summer winds facilitated southward journeys, but complicated northward travel, requiring ships sailing northward to make greater use of coastal routes where land and sea breezes could provide more favorable conditions. Winter wind patterns across the Mediterranean are considerably more variable, with low-pressure systems regularly traversing the basin from west to east, bringing periods of strong winds from changing directions, interspersed with calmer intervals. These winter storms, while typically lasting only 2 to 4 days each, can generate winds exceeding 40 knots and wave heights of 4 to 6 meters or more, creating hazardous conditions for ancient vessels. The frequency of these winter storms increases from south to north and from east to west across the Mediterranean basin, with the western Mediterranean experiencing the most active winter storm patterns. Rainfall patterns follow a similar seasonal distribution, with approximately 70 to 90% of annual precipitation occurring during the winter months from October through March. Annual rainfall totals vary considerably across the Mediterranean basin, from as little as 100 millimeters in parts of North Africa to over 1,000 millimeters in some northern and mountainous coastal regions. This precipitation pattern influenced not only maritime activities, but also agricultural cycles and the availability of export commodities. Visibility conditions also follow seasonal patterns that influenced ancient navigation. Summer months typically bring clearer atmospheric conditions, with visibility often extending 20 to 30 nautical miles or more, allowing sailors to sight distant landmarks and islands. Winter months, in contrast, more frequently experience reduced visibility due to precipitation, low cloud cover, or atmospheric haze, complicating navigation and increasing the hazards of maritime travel. These climate patterns created natural microclimates within the larger Mediterranean basin, particularly in regions where coastal mountains interrupt the prevailing wind patterns. The lee sides of islands and coastal headlands often experience significantly different wind conditions than surrounding areas, creating zones of relative calm that ancient mariners could utilize as sailing routes or sheltered anchorages. The eastern shores of the Adriatic Sea, for instance, are partially sheltered from the full force of winter storms by the Apennine Mountains of the Italian peninsula, creating a somewhat more protected sailing route during marginal seasons. Sea surface temperatures across the Mediterranean also follow annual cycles that influenced ancient maritime trade. Summer water temperatures typically range between 21 and 27 degrees Celsius, with the highest temperatures occurring in the eastern basin. Winter temperatures decrease to between 14 and 17 degrees Celsius in most regions, with slightly cooler temperatures in the northern Adriatic and Aegean seas. These relatively warm water temperatures, compared to those of the open Atlantic, created more favorable conditions for year-round maritime activity than existed in more northern European waters, contributing to the Mediterranean's central role in ancient commerce. Ocean currents within the Mediterranean, while generally less significant than in the open oceans, nonetheless created subtle patterns that experienced mariners could utilize. The predominant surface current flows counterclockwise around the Mediterranean basin, entering through the Strait of Gibraltar and flowing eastward along the North African coast before turning northward along the Levantan shores, and then westward along the northern basin. The speed of this current typically ranges from 0.5 to 1.5 knots, sufficient to noticeably influence a vessel's progress over the course of a day's sailing. The combination of these climatic factors, winds, storms, visibility, and currents created a complex but generally predictable environmental system within which ancient Mediterranean trade operated. Mariners developed detailed knowledge of these patterns through observation and experience, passing this understanding from generation to generation through direct instruction and early navigational texts. This environmental knowledge allowed them to work with natural patterns rather than against them, establishing trade routes and sailing schedules that adapted to rather than defied the Mediterranean's climate rhythms. As we approach the final portion of our peaceful Mediterranean journey, let us now consider the quiet development of port settlements and harbor infrastructure that supported the ancient trading networks. These coastal communities formed the essential nodes in the web of Mediterranean commerce. Their growth and development intimately connected to the geographical features that made them suitable locations for maritime activities. The earliest Mediterranean harbors utilized natural coastal features with minimal artificial modifications. Protected bays, the mouths of small rivers, and the lee sides of coastal headlands provided natural shelter from wind and waves. These early harbors typically featured water depths of 3 to 5 meters, sufficient for the shallow draft vessels of early maritime trade. Beach landings remained common during this period, with ships drawn up onto gently sloping sandy shores for loading and unloading when weather conditions permitted. The limitations of these natural harbors meant that maritime activities would often cease entirely during periods of unfavorable weather, creating a rhythm of activity that followed the patterns of local wind and wave conditions. As maritime trade gradually expanded, coastal communities began to make modest modifications to improve their natural harbors. These early improvements typically included the clearing of underwater obstacles, the construction of simple wooden piers extending into deeper water, and the establishment of basic navigation markers to guide vessels into safe anchorages. The typical wooden pier of this period might extend 30 to 50 meters from shore, constructed on wooden pilings driven into the seabed, and supporting a wooden deck approximately 3 to 4 meters wide. These structures facilitated the loading and unloading of vessels without requiring them to beach, improving efficiency and reducing the risk of damage to ship hulls. The development of more substantial harbor infrastructure emerged gradually over many centuries, with the most significant advances occurring during the Phoenician and Greek colonial periods. The construction of rubble breakwaters represented an important development in harbor engineering, providing artificial protection in locations where natural shelter was limited. These structures typically consisted of large stone blocks weighing 1 to 3 tons each, dumped into the sea to form a mound rising from the seabed to several meters above water level. A typical breakwater might extend 100 to 200 meters in length and measure 15 to 20 meters wide at its base. narrowing to 5 to 8 meters at its top. The construction of such a structure required enormous labor inputs, often extending over decades as communities gradually expanded their harbor protection. The orientation of these artificial harbors carefully considered the prevailing wind and wave patterns specific to each location. Entrance channels typically faced away from the direction of the most common or strongest waves, often requiring ships to make a sharp turn after entering the harbor mouth. This design feature created areas of particularly calm water within the harbor basin, enhancing the protection offered to moored vessels. The typical artificial harbor of the Middle Mediterranean period enclosed a water area of approximately 5 to 10 hectares, providing shelter for 30 to 60 trading vessels simultaneously. Within the protected harbor basin, waterfront facilities developed to support maritime commerce. Stone quays gradually replaced earlier wooden structures, providing more durable and stable platforms for loading and unloading activities. These quays typically stood about 1 to 1.5 meters above mean sea level, allowing them to remain usable through the normal tidal range of 20 to 40 centimeters found in most Mediterranean locations. The width of these quays generally measured between 5 and 10 meters, providing sufficient space for the temporary storage of goods and the movement of porters and carts. Mooring stones or bollards spaced at intervals of 5 to 8 meters along these quays provided secure attachment points for vessels. Warehouse facilities developed in close proximity to these waterfront structures, typically situated within 50 to 100 meters of the quayside, to minimize the distance goods needed to be transported. The earliest warehouses consisted of simple rectangular structures, measuring perhaps 10 to 15 meters in width and 20 to 30 meters in length, with stone foundations supporting mud brick or stone walls and timber roof structures. These buildings generally featured limited openings for security purposes, with goods moved through doorways typically 2 to 2.5 meters wide. Later warehouse development included the addition of upper floors accessed by ramps or stairs, increasing storage capacity within the limited space available in crowded port areas. The development of port facilities influenced the overall urban layout of coastal settlements, with street patterns often radiating outward from the harbor area. The primary commercial street typically ran parallel to the waterfront at a distance of 30 to 50 meters, providing space for merchants, suppliers, and service providers directly associated with maritime activities. Residential areas usually developed on higher ground behind this commercial zone, often arranged in roughly concentric patterns following the natural topography of coastal sites. The population of these port settlements varied considerably based on their commercial importance and geographical context. Minor trading stations might support permanent populations of perhaps 500 to 1,000 inhabitants, while major commercial centers could reach 15,000 to 20,000 residents or more. These populations typically increased seasonally during the height of the sailing season, with temporary residents, including sailors, merchants, and various service providers, adding perhaps 20 to 30% to the permanent population during these periods of peak activity. The administrative functions necessary to manage these port facilities gradually became more formalized over time. Harbor masters oversaw the allocation of berthing spaces, the collection of various port fees, and the maintenance of essential infrastructure. Customs officials monitored the flow of goods, ensuring the collection of appropriate taxes based on the value and nature of imported and exported commodities. The rates of these customs duties typically ranged from 2 to 5% of the estimated value of the goods, creating a significant source of revenue for port cities and the larger political entities that controlled them. The legacy of these ancient Mediterranean ports extends far beyond their immediate commercial functions. Many developed into significant urban centers that would influence the broader patterns of Mediterranean history and culture. The geographical advantages that made these locations suitable for ancient maritime trade, protected harbors, access to inland transport routes, proximity to agricultural hinterlands, continued to provide benefits through changing technological and political circumstances. Numerous modern Mediterranean cities continue to occupy the same locations as their ancient predecessors. Their contemporary port facilities representing the latest phase in a development process spanning 3 millennia or more. The interconnections between these port settlements created a network of relationships extending beyond purely commercial exchanges. Ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious concepts traveled alongside material goods, creating cultural connections that transcended political boundaries. The geographical framework of the Mediterranean basin, with its relatively short maritime distances between diverse cultural regions, facilitated these exchanges in ways that would have been much more difficult in less geographically favorable environments. As we conclude our gentle exploration of ancient Mediterranean trade routes, we can appreciate how the geographical features of this inland sea created a unique environment for the development of interconnected civilizations. The mountains and deserts that often isolated inland regions from one another contrasted with the maritime connections that linked coastal communities across considerable distances. This geographical reality transformed what might have been a barrier, the sea itself, into a facilitator of human interaction, a liquid plain across which people, goods, and ideas could move more easily than across many land routes. The patterns established during these ancient periods created enduring pathways that would continue to shape Mediterranean history through subsequent eras. the rhythms of seasonal navigation, the networks of port settlements, and the flows of commodities between regions of surplus and regions of demand created a framework for human activity intimately connected to the underlying geographical realities of the Mediterranean basin. These ancient patterns reveal how human societies adapt to and utilize their geographical environment, finding opportunity in the very features that might initially appear as limitations. And so, as the gentle waves continue their timeless rhythm against ancient shores, we conclude our peaceful journey through the geography of Mediterranean trade routes. May the slow rhythms of this ancient maritime world carry you toward restful sleep, floating gently on the calm waters of history and geography that connect distant shores across the wine-dark sea.